January 17, 1945. Bastogne, Belgium. The snow fell thick and silent over the Ardennes forest, each flake dissolving into the frozen blood that stained the crossroads. In a commandeered farmhouse 3 miles south of the German lines, a cluster of Wehrmacht field officers hunched over topographical maps, their breath forming pale clouds in the frigid air. The wood stove had long since consumed its final log. Outside, the wind carried the distant rumble of American artillery, closer now than it had been at dawn. One officer, a major from the 2nd Panzer Division, traced his finger along a blue line marking a road junction. His hand trembled, not from cold, but from something else entirely. A single word had reached them through intercepted radio chatter just after midnight. Patton. For 3 weeks, the German High Command had believed they had achieved the impossible. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Great Winter Offensive, had torn a 50-mile bulge into the American lines, encircling the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and threatening to split the Allied front in two. Field Marshal von Rundstedt had promised Hitler that the Americans were soft, undisciplined, incapable of responding to a coordinated winter assault. The Führer himself had declared that the decadent democracies would crumble under Teutonic steel. For a brief, intoxicating moment it seemed the prophecy might hold. Then George Smith Patton Jr. did something the German General Staff had calculated to be impossible. He pivoted his entire Third Army 4 divisions, more than 40,000 men, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, 90 degrees north through a blizzard, and drove them 70 miles through ice-choked roads in under 72 hours. When the lead elements of the 4th Armored Division smashed through the German encirclement on December 26, the myth of American military incompetence died in the snow alongside thousands of German soldiers who had been promised an easy victory. The Germans had studied Patton for years. They knew his record in North Africa, where his tanks had savaged Rommel's supply lines. They knew of Sicily, where he had raced Montgomery to Messina and won. But knowledge and understanding are different animals entirely. What the German generals failed to grasp, what their rigid, methodical minds could not reconcile, was that Patton represented something fundamentally alien to their conception of warfare. He was not merely a tactician or a strategist. He was an avatar of American industrial fury wedded to an Old Testament belief in retribution. He moved his armies the way a conductor commands a symphony, with intuition that bordered on the supernatural and logistics that revealed the true distance between German ideology and American reality. In the autumn of 1918, a young American lieutenant colonel had stood in the Argonne forest, watching French Renault tanks bog down in the mud. George Patton had commanded the 1st American tank unit in combat, and even then, even in that primitive dawn of mechanized warfare, he understood what the tank truly meant. It was the industrial age made manifest, the marriage of steel and petroleum and mass production, the physical embodiment of a nation that could outbuild and outproduce any enemy foolish enough to challenge it. While German officers studied Clausewitz and obsessed over Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement, Patton absorbed something deeper. He read Caesar and Alexander not for tactics, but for temper. He understood that modern war was not chess but jazz, not calculation but rhythm, and that the side which could improvise faster, supply more abundantly, and refuse to accept conventional limitations would dictate the terms of battle. By 1944, when Patton took command of the Third Army, he had refined this philosophy into an instrument of terrifying efficiency. His staff officers worked in shifts around the clock, coordinating fuel deliveries, ammunition trains, and replacement personnel with a precision that would have impressed Henry Ford. Patton demanded that his supply columns move at night, that his engineers construct bridges before the infantry arrived, that his reconnaissance units operate 50 miles ahead of the main force. He screamed at subordinates who spoke of consolidating positions or awaiting reinforcement. In Patton's universe there were only 2 acceptable states: attacking or preparing to attack. Everything else was defeat in slow motion. The German generals, products of the Prussian staff system, found this approach incomprehensible. Their war doctrine emphasized careful preparation, detailed planning and the methodical application of force against identified weak points. An army was a machine to be calibrated and deployed according to established principles, but Patton treated his army like a living organism, feeding it from an endless logistics pipeline and pushing it forward with a relentlessness that seemed to violate the basic laws of human endurance. After the breakout from Normandy in August 1944, the Third Army advanced across France so rapidly that Supreme Headquarters struggled to track its position. In 30 days, Patton's forces covered 400 miles, liberated thousands of square miles of territory, and consumed fuel and ammunition at rates that terrified the Allied logisticians. The Germans, retreating in chaos, kept receiving reports that seemed physically impossible. Patton's tanks had been spotted in Chartres. Now they were in Orléans. Now they had crossed the Seine. How could an entire army move that fast? Where was the logistical tail? When would they have to stop to regroup? The answer, which the Wehrmacht discovered too late, was that Patton had no intention of stopping. His supply officers performed miracles, his engineers built bridges at record speed, and his combat troops learned to function on minimal sleep and maximum aggression. When fuel shortages threatened to halt the advance in September, Patton's staff officers diverted supplies meant for other armies, an act of bureaucratic piracy that infuriated Eisenhower, but kept the Third Army rolling east. The Germans, accustomed to operational pauses and consolidation phases, kept waiting for the Americans to halt and reorganize. Patton never gave them the opportunity. But it was not merely speed that terrified the German high command. It was the totality of the thing, the sheer material abundance that backed every American offensive. A German panzer division in late 1944 was a fragile instrument, dependent on horse-drawn supply wagons and jerry-rigged logistics. Fuel was scarce, ammunition rationed, replacement tanks non-existent. The average German soldier knew that every tank lost was gone forever, that every artillery barrage expended irreplaceable shells, that the industrial might of the Reich was collapsing under Allied bombing. Patton's army existed in a different universe entirely. His soldiers ate hot meals prepared in mobile kitchens. They wore new boots. When a tank broke down, it was repaired or replaced within hours. When an artillery battery exhausted its ammunition, fresh shells arrived before the next fire mission. The Third Army consumed thousands of gallons of gasoline every hour, and the fuel kept coming, ferried across the Atlantic in Liberty ships built in American yards at a rate of 3 per day. To the German defenders, this abundance became psychological warfare. They could destroy an American tank company in the morning and watch 2 fresh companies appear by afternoon. They could shatter an infantry battalion and see it rebuilt to full strength within a week. The Americans didn't just replace losses, they exceeded them. A German lieutenant captured near Metz in November 1944 told his interrogators that fighting the Third Army felt like battling the ocean. You might push back one wave, but 10 more were already forming behind it, and eventually, inevitably, you would drown. This was the arithmetic of industrial warfare, and Patton was its most ruthless account. In the frozen forests around Bastogne, the German officers who had launched the Ardennes offensive with such confidence now confronted the terrible reality of what they faced. Patton had done more than relieve Bastogne. He had revealed the fundamental bankruptcy of German strategic thinking. The Führer and his generals had gambled everything on a single throw, concentrating their last mobile reserves for one desperate lunge toward Antwerp. They had achieved surprise. They had achieved initial success, and then Patton had appeared, and the entire calculus collapsed. Because unlike the German army, which could only strike once and then retreat to lick its wounds, Patton's Third Army could absorb losses, regenerate, and attack again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, forever, until the enemy broke. The German intelligence services maintained thick files on all Allied commanders. Eisenhower was categorized as a politician, skilled at managing coalitions, but lacking battlefield instinct. Montgomery was methodical, cautious, predictable. Bradley was competent, but conventional. But Patton's file was different. It contained not just tactical assessments but psychological profiles, because the German staff officers understood that facing Patton required more than military preparation. It required mental fortitude. Intercepted letters from German soldiers described a commander who seemed to possess supernatural awareness of enemy positions, who attacked from unexpected angles, who never allowed his opponents time to rest or reorganize. A captured German major from the 11th Panzer Division, when asked why his experienced unit had retreated from a numerically inferior American force near Nancy, replied simply, "We knew it was Patton's army. To stay would have been to die." This fear was not born from any single battle but from cumulative experience, from the grinding realization that Patton represented a form of warfare that German doctrine could not counter. In North Africa, Rommel had maneuvered his forces brilliantly, but Patton's tanks had ranged across the desert with a freedom that German supply constraints could never match. In Sicily, the German defenders had fought skillfully, but Patton's advance had been so rapid that entire divisions found themselves cut off and captured. In France, the Wehrmacht had tried to establish defensive lines at the Seine, at the Moselle, at the Metz fortifications, and each time Patton's army had smashed through with a combination of speed, firepower, and logistical endurance that rendered traditional defensive planning obsolete. The German generals, trained to think in terms of operational art and strategic elegance, found themselves drowning in American trucks and shells and gasoline. Patton himself understood the psychological dimension of this completely. He wore ivory-handled revolvers not because they were practical, but because they were theatrical. He designed his uniform to be instantly recognizable, a costume that announced his presence. He visited frontline units constantly, appearing in his jeep amid artillery fire, always immaculate, always radiating absolute confidence. His profanity was legendary, his temper volcanic, but beneath the performance was cold calculation. Patton wanted the Germans to fear him. He wanted them to know that when the Third Army appeared, their choices were simple: retreat or die. There would be no negotiation, no respite, no mercy. This was not cruelty, but efficiency. An enemy paralyzed by fear made fewer mistakes, and collapsed fast. The ivory-handled revolvers became a symbol that German intelligence briefings mentioned specifically. Staff officers warned their subordinates to expect aggressive, immediate counterattacks if they encountered units bearing Third Army insignia. The distinctive white star marked on American tanks became a death's head to German troops who had learned through bitter experience that Patton's armor would not pause, would not consolidate, would simply keep rolling forward, crushing everything that stood in its path. In POW interrogations conducted throughout 1944 and 1945, German soldiers repeatedly mentioned Patton by name, not Eisenhower, not Bradley, but Patton, as the commander they most dreaded facing. After Bastogne, the rout accelerated. Patton drove his army through the Siegfried Line, across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany itself. His units advanced so rapidly that they liberated concentration camps, whose SS guards had fled only hours before, revealing horrors that justified every mile of American fury. The Third Army reached Czechoslovakia by war's end, having traversed the length of Europe in less than a year, having destroyed or captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, having demonstrated beyond any doubt that American democracy, when roused to violence, could marshal resources and ruthlessness that no totalitarian state could match. The final German casualty reports told the story in stark numbers. From August 1944 to May 1945, the Third Army had killed or wounded over 500,000 German soldiers. It had captured nearly another million. It had destroyed or captured thousands of tanks, artillery pieces and vehicles, and it had done this while sustaining lower casualties than any comparable Allied army, because Patton understood that speed was survival, that aggression prevented casualties, that an enemy kept constantly off balance could not effectively fight back. The German generals, reading these reports in the ruins of their shattered Reich, finally understood the magnitude of their miscalculation. They had believed American soldiers were soft shopkeepers playing at war. They had discovered instead that Americans were shopkeepers who had industrialized war itself, who had learned to produce violence with the same efficiency they produced automobiles and refrigerators, and who had found in Patton the perfect instrument to deliver that violence to its target. In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and surrender, a group of captured German generals were assembled for debriefing by American intelligence officers. One of the interrogators, curious about something that had puzzled Allied command throughout the campaign, asked a simple question: of all the Allied commanders, which had the Germans feared most? The answer came without hesitation, without debate, unanimous among men who had spent their lives studying warfare. Not Montgomery with his methodical set-piece battles, not Eisenhower with his strategic vision, not Bradley with his steady competence. Patton, always Patton. Because Patton was not just a general but a revelation, the embodiment of what America could do when it chose to fight, when it married its industrial capacity to military purpose, when it abandoned the pretense of civilized warfare, and embraced the arithmetic of total war. The final irony was that Patton himself, this avatar of democratic fury, was killed not by German bullets, but by a traffic accident in occupied Germany, his neck broken in a collision with a truck, dying in a hospital bed rather than on the battlefield he had dominated. But by then the lesson had been taught, the message delivered. The German generals who survived the war, who wrote their memoirs and analyses in the decades that followed, returned again and again to the same uncomfortable truth. They had lost not because their tactics were inferior, or their soldiers less brave, but because they had faced an enemy whose abundance was inexhaustible, whose logistics were flawless, and whose commander understood that modern war was not about honor or doctrine, or tactical elegance. It was about oil and steel and trucks and shells, and the will to use them without restraint until the enemy had no choice but submission. The snow that fell on Bastogne in January 1945 eventually melted. The dead were buried, the wreckage cleared, the forests replanted. But the memory persisted, passed down through generations of military officers on both sides of the Atlantic. In American staff colleges, Patton's campaigns became textbook examples of mobile warfare. In German military academies, they became cautionary tales about the dangers of underestimating democratic resolve. And in the small museums and memorials scattered across France and Belgium and Germany, the artifacts remained: the ivory-handled revolvers, the tanks marked with white stars, the photographs of a lean man in a shined helmet, staring at the camera with eyes that promised only one thing: that if you stood in his way, he would run you down, and there would be no pause, no mercy, no negotiation, only the terrible, relentless momentum of American power unleashed, and the man who had learned to ride that power like a force of nature, straight through the heart of Hitler's Europe, until there was nothing left to destroy.